Okay, so can you hear me? Okay, so while I'm talking to you guys, you're gonna have to let me know in the chat if there's ever any trouble with the microphone, if it needs to be raised, or if there's ever any distortion or anything. So this is the first time I've done this through live streaming, so I want to make sure everything is squared away. So a bunch of you submitted questions to me, and I'm going to deal with most of them. I just have to say though that questions about specific empires we're going to be handling in the after school review sessions, which I am going to be posting online. Also, if you were at today's review session, there was a slight problem with the video. It only recorded about 40 minutes of the review session, so it did get all of the coverage of Latin America and the Caribbean, but part of the coverage about sub-Saharan Africa got cut off. So I'm going to try to figure that out, and from now on, I promise those review sessions, their entirety will be posted online. So for like the dynasties and empires of India, we're not going to get into that tonight, but that's something we're going to do in later review sessions after school, and it will be posted on this channel. So there are a few specific things that people ask me about that we're going to get into right now. So first, I was asked to explain what capitalism is. Now, capitalism, this is something that really becomes a super big deal in the 1500s and 1600s. And the context there is that European countries are going to the Indian Ocean and creating a global trade system for the first time. And the way that some of those countries are actually engaging in overseas trade is really the beginning of modern capitalism. Now, what it means, though, is taking capital and investing it. So capital refers to any money that you already have, any assets you already have that you can use to invest in a business or in the production of goods or the trade for goods with the goal of making a profit. The profit motive is really like the key aspect of capitalism. So what this means is that, for example, if you're like a British dude and you have some money lying around, you can invest in a company or you can buy stock in a company. And a joint stock company is the mechanism by which you do this. So let's say that you and your friends want to create a company. Then you would say, all right, we're going to sell stock. So we're going to get money from investors. We're going to get capital from investors. We're going to buy our ships. We're going to go trade, and we're going to make a profit. And the people who invested capital, however many shares of your company they own, they'll presumably get some of that profit. So this is something that becomes very popular in countries like England and the Netherlands because they don't have like huge supplies of silver in their colonies overseas that they can go and get to make money. They have to figure out other ways to take whatever resources they have and then make profits and sort of build on the money they have. So if you make some profit, you can reinvest it and then reinvest it and reinvest it and just sort of continuously make more money if you're good enough at business and if there's like demand for the stuff you're selling. So the British and the Dutch, especially the Dutch, through the Dutch East India Company, they started to make huge amounts of profits in global trade during the 1600s and 1700s. And countries like the Spanish kind of fell behind because they never really figured out this mechanism by which profit could be made continuously. So some other aspects of capitalism are the other sort of institutions that back them up. Whoops. So once people buy stock, they can sell their stock. They can, sell it to other investors for a profit. So if you buy like a share of Apple and another investor thinks that they're going to make more money in the future and you just want to cash out and make a little profit right now, you can sell that share for a higher price than you bought it to somebody else. And that becomes the basis for stock exchanges. That's another sort of aspect of capitalism. And banks are created where people will pool all of their capital. And then the bank itself will decide what to invest in on their behalf. So if you are if you're too busy and you don't really want to bother figuring out what to invest in, you can give your money to an investment bank and they can go invest it for you, and then you'll own shares through them and make some money, hopefully. Now, when you're investing capital, though, you're taking risk. So if you want to reduce your risk and potentially be able to make back some money, even if the business goes out of business, you can buy insurance. So let's say that if you are the owner of one of these companies, or if you're one of the directors of a joint stock company, you're buying ships to go and trade with India from Britain. It's a long way, it's dangerous. So you might buy insurance from an insurance company. You give them a little bit of money to buy an insurance policy. And then if your ship sink or something, then the insurance company will pay back some money to you based on whatever the policy is. And they make money by hoping that they don't actually have to pay back insurance, and they can keep the money that people give them. Now, the phrase free market capitalism, this refers not just to the act of investment for making profit, but the idea that along with allowing people to invest money to make a profit, you should also have a system where there's no government regulation, or as little regulation as possible, on the way that markets work. And a market is simply just the place where buyers and sellers meet in order to exchange goods and exchange money with each other. So free market capitalism implies that within a particular country or within a particular market, the price will be whatever people are willing to pay for it, and the price that people are willing to pay can be dictated by how much demand there is and how little or how much of a resource there is. So if there's tons and tons of a resource and nobody really wants to buy it, the price is going to go down because there's so much of it, and the people trying to sell it will basically take any price to get rid of it. But if there's a lot of demand and very little of something, the price will go up because the people selling it will know that they can, that they don't have much of it and people really, really want it. So free market capitalism means that buyers and sellers will agree on whatever price sort of makes sense to them in order to actually exchange goods or exchange services. Now, there are pros and cons to all of this. So the pro is that in societies where capitalism happens and is allowed, a lot of money can be made, huge amounts of money. And if companies sell stock, then that means that anyone who can afford to buy in can make some money. So it can kind of broaden the amount of people who can actually sort of develop wealth within that kind of system. Now, a potential con is that particular companies might become incredibly good, or particular companies might have so much wealth that they can basically buy political influence, whether that's legal or not, and reduce the likelihood of other companies competing with them. So also, this can lead to a situation where there's a huge amount of economic inequality if it's not sort of maintained properly. So some companies, some people can make insane amounts of money, while others simply just are left out in the cold and can't really make any money at all. So there is the possibility for great inequality, but there's also the possibility for huge wealth generation as well, and sort of general prosperity. So now another question came to me about the word liberalism. And this is a word that has a lot of different meanings in a lot of different places. But in the context of world history and European history as well, liberalism very specifically refers to a philosophy that was derived from the European Enlightenment of the 1700s. And if you were a liberal in the 17 or 1800s based on Enlightenment principles, then it meant a couple things. And there are different sort of forms of liberalism. Number one, for politics and for social ideas. basic idea is that when you give people liberty, that's the basis for a good society and for a prosperous society. So you're going to see that liberals will usually advocate for capitalism. That basically, like, if you sort of let people do what they mostly want to do without hurting other people, that's good. Now, political and social liberals also advocate religious toleration. That basically just let people be whatever religion they want, that's fine. And that natural rights, one of the core ideas of the Enlightenment, should be respected. That everyone has natural rights and don't get in the way of people being allowed to use their rights, as long as they don't hurt anybody. Now, another aspect of liberalism is that all people should be equal before the law, and no distinction should be made for wealth or social class. So, whether you're, an aristocrat or the king or the richest guy in the world or the poorest guy in the world, everyone is subject to the same laws, and no one can buy their way out of trouble. Also then, liberals generally advocated written constitutions, where there are clear rules that says this is what governments can do, this is what they can't do. This is the power that government has, these are the powers they don't have. So, rather than just having an emperor or a king who is godlike and can do whatever he wants, with no regard for how it affects people. And generally, liberals advocated the idea that elected representatives should serve the people, rather than, people who aren't really subject to oversight by the people themselves. So, now, in world history, though, the idea of economic liberalism is also a hugely important concept, but something that isn't necessarily totally related to political and social liberalism. So political and social liberalism, people who believe in these ideas may not necessarily believe in economic liberalism. This refers to what's also called laissez-faire economics, which in French, that means something like, just kind of let them do what they want. This means specifically with regards to trade and commerce. People should be allowed to do pretty much whatever they want, with some limits. And generally, economic liberals feel that people, as individuals, and nations as a whole, should be free to buy things, to sell things, to produce what they want, to do whatever work they want. So no one should be forced to be a slave. No one should be forced into serfdom to, work for their landlord with no choice. One should be paid, for the work they're doing or for the goods they're selling. Now, economic liberals generally advocated the idea that governments should promote trade, domestic trade. So they should promote people buying and selling and producing stuff within their countries. They should promote global trade. So if, one country doesn't have something, they can trade with another country to get it without any real restrictions. But they shouldn't interfere with trade. They should allow trade to happen freely. So this is kind of related to free market capitalism. Now, economic liberals also advocate the idea that private property ownership is a natural right. That whether it's land or a piece of furniture or a warehouse full of, cotton or something, if you own something, it's yours. And the government can't take it away from you. Other people shouldn't be allowed to take it. The king can't say, hey, I am the king, I am taking this. Private property ownership is a natural right. Now, communists obviously disagree with this idea because they think that private property is theft from the people, is the basis for inequality in the world, which was a very sort of rigid system where people were told what job they were doing, what they were producing, how much of something they were allowed to buy or sell or consume. After the end of the Cold War, communist countries generally started to adopt capitalist ideas, and countries where there was free market capitalism started to advocate what was known as neoliberalism, where basically, the United States was among these countries where our governments and business leaders started to push for the spread of free market capitalism and economic liberalism to more of the world. And the idea was that, if we allowed these developing countries that had just broken away from communism to adopt these liberal capitalist ideas, then they would become wealthier, they would become more peaceful, more prosperous, and the world would be happier as a result. So this is something that contributed to the really rapid globalization of the world economy after the end of the Cold War, where now, to an unprecedented amount, all of the countries of the world are in these sort of deep trade connections and interdependence with each other. So, all right, let's continue. Now, I got another question about the specific religions that you should study, that you should know about for this exam. So there's a few big ones that are really sort of must know. So first of all, know that in every single society in the world, the traditional religion, and this is going back to like Paleolithic hunter-gatherers and pretty much every early society in the world, every society's original religion was polytheistic, with a belief in multiple gods and goddesses that controlled different forces in the universe. And sometimes this was animistic. Animism means when you look at the natural world and you think that the objects in the natural world are the things that have sort of divine power, or thunderstorms, and just all of the sort of natural forces and objects in the world. So this is generally what like the earliest religions known to humankind were. Now, other religions, though, will eventually emerge and be sort of, the new religions, so to speak. So in India, obviously you need to know about Hinduism, and you need to know about Buddhism. And Hinduism is kind of an updated version of the sort of traditional polytheistic religion of India, which was also known as Vedic religion, because the Vedas were the earliest known scriptures in that particular religious system. So, Hinduism and Buddhism, you need to know the basics about these. And also in India then, Sikhism was a syncretic religion that emerged there in the 16 and 1700s, where some ideas from Islam, like monotheistic ideas about God, were combined with Hindu ideas, like reincarnation, and that you're trying to like rejoin God after your death. So, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism in India. In China, the big three there. Sorry, my dogs are causing trouble. Legalism, Taoism, and Confucianism. So, these three philosophies all came out of the Warring States era in China. And basically, legalism, this is the one that essentially says that the basis for a good society is to follow the rules, that law and the application of reward and punishment by a ruler is the way to maintain a good, orderly society. Taoism was the one that said you should follow the Tao and go with the flow. And basically that means, allow nature to take its course. Don't try to impose any sort of unnecessary structure on top of nature. And then Confucianism was the basic social and political philosophy that that basically you need to sort of understand and respect the relationships among people in the world, and the relationship that people have to those above and below them in society, and within the family itself, especially. So, Confucianism, of course, became the most popular philosophy among Chinese dynasties. So, I just want to take a quick second here to do another sound test. So, in chat, let me know if there's been any trouble with the video feed or with the audio feed. Okay, Taylor, you say everything is perfect. I think you're a trustworthy fellow. I hope I can trust you on this one. So, we're continuing. So now, in the Middle East and Mediterranean region, the things to know from here. Zoroastrianism emerged in Persia. That is that's like the earliest monotheistic religion in Persia. Judaism emerged as well. And remember, like, monotheism is something that was kind of unique to the Middle East and Mediterranean as a religious idea. It's not something that really sort of appears in a number of different places. So Zoroastrianism in Persia, that's the one where it's a struggle of good and evil in the world. Judaism adopted some ideas from Zoroastrianism. And part of the reason for that is because the Jewish people, the Hebrews, the Israelites, had been conquered by the Persian Empire and were treated very well by the Persians. The Persians were very tolerant of Jewish culture, Jewish language, and religion, and there was a lot of sort of intermixing of ideas there. So Judaism also then adopted ideas of good versus evil, and that there is a good God who gives you specific ethical instructions about how to live your life in order to please God. And that was the basis for the Ten Commandments and the Jewish scripture, which are books about like laws and expectations that God has for you. And the agreement between the Jewish people and the one God was known as the covenant. Now, also then, in Greek and Roman Judaism, yes, Judaism. So in the Greek world and the Roman world of the classical era, they also developed a unique sort of rational philosophy, where logic and scientific thinking started to become more common. And that was partly because in those civilizations, they were still very focused around a polytheistic religion, where the gods were extremely badly behaved and were not really good models of ethical behavior or a good way to live your life. You know, the gods, they fought with each other, they had affairs with each other, they were just like not necessarily good beings to look up to. So Greek philosophers started to kind of think themselves like, oh, we need to figure out how to live a good life because the gods aren't teaching us. We need to figure it out ourselves. So rational philosophy, the use of logic and reason to understand ethics and to understand how the universe works, became very rooted in Greco-Roman culture. Then, of course, within the Roman Empire, in the 1st century CE, there's Christianity, based around the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. So, and this was something that became popular really first among like the lower classes in the Roman Empire, because the message was that not just one particular group of people, but anybody could follow God's law. Anyone could devote themselves to God and be saved in the afterlife and go to heaven, you know, no matter how poor or rich or whatever. So this was a very appealing sort of individualistic religion at first. And then gradually it grew around the Mediterranean within the Roman Empire and became the most popular religion there by the 300s CE, when it was legalized, and eventually became the official religion. And it was sort of organized into a hierarchical institution called the Catholic Church, and that split into the Catholic and Orthodox churches when the Roman Empire split. But now, also then, finally in the 600s, Islam began with the revelations to the Prophet Muhammad. So Islam is like the final one of the new monotheistic religions. Of course, that became the basis for an empire in the Middle East and North Africa, and became the sort of core religion of those particular areas, and then continued to spread from there. Remember, Islam, though, is based in earlier monotheisms. So it has the same ideas of good and evil and ethical expectations by God. And it is also a very sort of individual religion, because it's you praying to God, and that's it. You. There's no like intermediaries, there's no church hierarchy or priests, it's you and God. But the you and God situation is within a sort of community context. So the 5 pillars, know them. The 5 pillars were all practices that were intended to kind of like connect you to other members of the Muslim community, like going on the Hajj to Mecca and giving charity to the poor, etc., etc. So, let's see. No, I do not believe the world is flat. The world is a sphere. That's it. So, now, so you should know where these religions began. You should know where they diffused to, if anywhere. And how? Was it by conquest? Was it through merchant activity? Remember, some of these, like Hinduism, kind of stayed in the place where they began, and others, like Christianity, became much more widespread, sometimes through trade, sometimes through conquest, where like conquering people like the Spanish brought it to Latin America and gave it to Native Americans there. You should know some things about how they changed or syncretized as they spread. So did they split or have a schism? So Christianity split a couple of times. Buddhism split at least once. Islam, there was a schism there between different types of Muslims, the Sunnis and the Shiites. So, and then finally, like, what was their relationship to political states and social hierarchies? So this means, like, was the religion used by an empire to justify their rule, you know, as a claim to divine right? Or was it used as the justification for a social class system, like the Hindu caste system or the Confucian system? So I would say you don't really need to focus on any one religion more than others, because they're all going to appear. Now, I would say, though, that the ones that have become the biggest, like Confucianism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, you'll probably see questions more likely to touch on those than like the smaller ones, like Sikhism. But you should sort of know the basics about all of them. So, let's see. Now, oh yeah, so someone asked me about the Latin American and the Haitian Revolutions. We're going to go through the basics of these really quick. So, number 1, Latin America, the revolutions there in the 1810s and 20s. Let's see. Yeah, so Greco-Roman philosophy, just to touch on the question here in the chat, Greco-Roman philosophy was the basis for all sorts of new scientific ideas and mathematical ideas, etc. So the Greeks, they were into like geometry and really good at that. And also during the Hellenistic era, when Greek philosophy diffused into the Middle East, after Alexander's conquests there, then Islamic scientists and mathematicians later picked up those ideas and developed them. So like algebra was invented by Arab Muslim mathematicians based on some ideas that the Greeks had left behind. So, Latin American revolutions. Hold on, my dogs are going crazy again. Gus, Lucy, stop. Okay. So, all right, sorry about that. So, Latin America, most of it was under the control of the Spanish in the 1800s, after they had conquered the Aztec Empire and the Inca Empire. And Brazil, though, was under the control of the Portuguese. Now, the French Revolution was already happening in Europe. And in the course of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte became the Emperor of France. And he tried to conquer all of Europe. And he overthrew the king and queen of Spain and Portugal. Now, in the Spanish colonies, there was a power structure in place there. And I'll put this up at causes, because that's what we're talking about. There was a power structure in place where officials sent to the colonies by the king and queen of Spain called peninsulares. They were the ones who were the governors, the tax collectors, the archbishops in the church in the colonies. They were the sort of like elite group that really ran the place. But then there was this group called Creoles, a sort of like secondary elite. This was white colonists who owned land, or owned the mines, or owned farms and ranches and stuff. They were the ones who made a lot of money in the colonies. They were the ones really like doing a lot of the work, but they weren't really in control. And there were a lot of restrictions that the Spanish placed on like who they could trade with. They couldn't trade with any other colonies or countries in America, for example. And they were never allowed to have like the upper level of leadership jobs in the colonies. So Creoles kind of resented the peninsulares. And by extension, they kind of resented the monarchy of Spain also. So below the Creoles, there were mestizos, or people of mixed race between Native Americans and whites. And generally, these people were a class that was created when white Spanish colonists married Native Americans, or when like elite Native Americans who were willing to be loyal to the Spanish after they took over the colonies were given special positions in society, or were allowed to own land or something like that. And then below the mestizos, there were huge numbers of Native Americans and black Africans and so on. So there was a huge amount of inequality, and there was slavery. And among the Creoles especially, these were people who were educated, were wealthy, and were aware of Europe and European culture. So they had become very interested in the Enlightenment, and they liked the idea of liberty and freedom and independence and self-government and those sorts of things. So when the Spanish monarchy was overthrown, the Spanish monarchy was overthrown, and the Creole leaders of Latin American society at that point thought, aha, now's our chance. So they declared independence, and in order to get like Native Americans and mestizos on board with this idea, they promised to create constitutional republics where everyone would have equal rights, and where, you know, even people at the lower end of society would be respected and have natural rights. And they promised to abolish slavery, although there was some disagreement there, because there were plenty of people in the colonies who depended on slavery, at least in their minds, to maintain their prosperity. So kind of like in the United States, after the United States became independent, there were disputes over should slavery continue, or like how should we sort of phase it out over time. The same disputes occurred in Latin America. And actually, I'm going to put this up here too, leaders and goals. So the leaders were mostly Creoles, and the most famous of these guys was Simón Bolívar. And he was Colombian. So, okay, there's a question here. A Creole marrying a Native American, having a son, Creole dies. So basically, as long as the Creole, took that son as legitimate, then yes, that child would be allowed to inherit and become an elite, just like the Creole, as long as it's, okay with the guy before he dies. So Simón Bolívar is considered one of the liberators of Latin America. So the goal of guys like him was to have a constitutional republic. Some other elements within the Creoles who wanted independence, but still wanted to maintain their positions of power and authority and eliteness and so on. So this coalition of different groups of people was able to hold together long enough to win their independence. And by the mid-1820s, basically all of Latin America is independent. And the Spanish monarchy, after it comes back when Napoleon's defeated, they're not able to bring the provinces or the colonies back under their control. So they're successful at abolishing slavery. They're successful at creating independent constitutional republics, but they're not successful at creating as much equality or opportunity as they want. So the elite Creoles who own the land and own the mines and so on, they're still the ones who really have the political power, the economic power, and Native Americans and so on would really have to go like decades more and really almost to the present day. And even still now, there are inequalities in some countries between like Native Americans and Creoles. So now into the Haitian Revolution. So this is in Haiti. This was a French colony, and during the French Revolution, Haiti, first of all, it was called Saint-Domingue before the revolution. It was the most profitable sugar colony in the Americas. Wall-to-wall sugar plantations owned by a small number of white colonists, and 97% of the population were black African slaves. And then there were also a few free blacks as well, people who had been freed from slavery for whatever reason by their masters. So the free blacks, they were kind of like the Creoles in Latin America. They wanted to have more rights, they wanted to have more respect from the elite group. And of course, then you've got slaves who want to be free. So when the French Revolution began, Haiti, as well as the free black population, they organized a revolt against the big landowners. And they recruited slaves and basically said, listen, we're all going to get our liberty now. We are going to become free and independent and equal. So the slaves joined this rebellion, and within a few years, the French government gives them their backing and allows the slaves to become free. Now, Napoleon, he wanted to like turn the plantations back on. So I'm going to put all this up there. So he wanted to literally tell like hundreds of thousands of slaves who had just become free, like, hey, you're all going to be slaves again now. Go back to work on the plantations. But now what was a rebellion by slaves turns into an independence war. And by 1804, they're able to win their independence and become once again a constitutional independent republic. But the most famous leader of the Haitian Revolution was a guy named Toussaint Louverture, who was a free black and really like the first great military leader of this rebellion. And he actually, I think there's like a middle school or something named after him somewhere in Broward County, if I'm not mistaken. So he's kind of a big deal in Haiti. Now, the success then. They became independent. The slaves won their freedom. They basically got the basic political things they wanted. Now, the failures that they ran into, though. Once again, it's difficult to like put together a working country. And one big problem that they ran into is that once all of the former slaves were no longer working in backbreaking labor on sugar plantations, they didn't like want to go back to work on plantations again. They wanted to become like small farmers who would grow their own food and become self-sufficient. Excuse me. So you had this kind of struggle between some political leaders who wanted to maintain a plantation system versus small farmers and former slaves who wanted to be more independent and more sort of self-sufficient. So there were problems like getting their economy off the ground, and other countries in America, like Brazil and the United States, that still had slavery, they basically like cut Haiti off. They didn't want to like give recognition to the fact that these slaves had won their own freedom. So like slave owners in the US were like, no, we can't give them any legitimacy by saying that it's okay to like break away from slavery, because they didn't want that to happen in their own country. So this is something that was kind of a double-edged sword, the fact that they had won their freedom from slavery. So now, next thing we're going to get into here. Someone asked me about trade networks, to just kind of go over some of the basics here about where they are and how they operate. So remember, the big trade networks in Afro-Eurasia that began mostly during the classical and post-classical eras, there's sort of four blocks of trade that all connect in the Middle East. So the Silk Road connected China with Central Asia, with India, with the Middle East and Persia, and then the Mediterranean Sea. So silk from China could make it all the way through these cities by caravan, through Central Asia, changing hands multiple times, price going up and up and up, and then making its way all the way into the Mediterranean. In the Mediterranean Sea, this connected the Middle East with the Byzantine Empire, Greece, Italy, so the major Italian cities where the Renaissance happened, Spain, and then out to like Northern Europe as well. So there could be silk from China or like porcelain from China that would go end up in Western Europe because it would pass through the Silk Road and then through the Mediterranean. Or it could go down through the Sahara Desert into Mali and Ghana in West Africa. And this trade route also depended on camel caravans to cross the desert. But basically, the West Africans, until the 1500s, when Europeans showed up, they traded only with North Africa and to some extent with Central Africa, because that was the zone that they had access to with the technology of the time. So the Indian Ocean connected East Africa, the Swahili coast, with the Middle East, with the Arabian Peninsula, with Persia, with India, with Southeast Asia down by the Strait of Malacca, with China. So this sector of the sort of Afro-Eurasian Trade Network, this is where you had more bulk goods because you could just dump a bunch of spices on a ship, or giant, trees that were cut down in East Africa or something. But basically then, the volume of trade on the Indian Ocean is usually going to be way higher than on the Silk Road or the Trans-Sahara, because you don't need to have all the camels or horses, you don't need to have as many people to guard your stuff. So the cost of shipping and the speed of shipping will generally be faster around the Indian Ocean. But it depends on the monsoon winds that go back and forth at different seasons of the year. So merchants would go one direction at one point of the year, other direction at the other point of the year. You kind of bounce from city to city. So once again, maritime trade is cheaper and allows more sort of bulk shipment than overland trade. But remember though, these four spokes in this wheel of trade all met in the hub of the Middle East. So until the 1500s, until Europeans started circumventing Africa in the Middle East and started going to America and creating a global trade system, the Middle East is where it was all happening. That was like the center, the hub that connected all of this trade and was like the focal point for international trade. So once you have a global system of trade, though, this changes everything. Because now an even bigger percentage of global trade is happening by maritime routes, by ocean going and ships and so on. And once again, Europeans are circumventing the Middle East and Africa and going directly to Asia themselves and back and forth. So that means that some parts of the world, like the Ottoman Empire in the 15 and 1600s, will see their prospects decline a little bit, simply because they're not the place where all of the goods are flowing through and where merchants are congregating anymore. So global trade then that connects the Americas and Afro-Eurasia is going to be based primarily on Europeans doing the movement and trading. So there aren't going to be any Chinese merchants showing up in Mexico. It's going to be Europeans moving the stuff back and forth around the world for the most part once you get to this time period. And remember, the silver is coming from Spanish America and going to Europe to pay for goods brought in there by other countries, or going across the Pacific to the Philippines, where the Spanish did actually conquer a little territory and use that as kind of like a through point for trade. So let me see what I've got here. Okay, so that's where I'll stop for now. So before I sign off, any other quick questions before I bid you all a good evening? Okay, so Wazi, here's a quick answer to your question. The encomienda and mita system. So in the Spanish colonies in America, the encomienda and mita system were both systems of forced labor, where Native Americans were forced to work for Spanish colonists. The encomienda was in Mesoamerica only, and that's where, like, someone who was given a ranch or a farm or something would also be granted the labor of a certain number of Native Americans or like number of villages. So it was kind of like serfdom for Native Americans. In the Mita system, that was in the Andes Mountains. That actually was a system that the Inca Empire was already using, and the Spanish just kept on using it because it was already like organized and it already sort of worked. That was not a system of like serfdom, but basically in that system though, a certain like percentage of families or people in a village would be like drafted to go and do some forced labor every year or every few months. So it wasn't just like across the board, all of these people belong to you, Mr. Spanish colonist. It's every year, we'll sort of select another chunk of the population to go and work in like a rotating draft system. So they're both forced labor systems. They worked in slightly different ways, and they weren't slavery. Like these people couldn't be bought or sold. It was just labor that was granted to colonists for whatever use they needed it for. So, and then you sort of get to the underside of the other direction, and yeah. All right. So let's see. Brit, here's a quick answer to your question. For historical figures, you should know like what they're famous for. So somebody like Jesus or Mao Zedong or Fidel Castro or whomever, you should kind of know like the things that they are famous for, whether it was for religious leadership or political leadership, or they were a great sort of like, I don't know, writer or artist or whatever. The background of the person themselves, I would say it's not quite as important as what they did. Although if you see like a document by that person on a BBQ, it might be helpful to know like a little bit about sort of what they were in order to really sort of understand the full context. So I'm going to put this away for the evening. Next time I'm going to do this, probably, I don't know, I'll let you guys know. I'll send a remind. I'll let you guys know in class, but you can probably expect like one or two more of these types of sessions before the exam. So remember, tomorrow after school, we're going to do another review. I'm going to cover South Asia and Southeast Asia, and I'm probably going to cover either the Middle East or China tomorrow as well. So have a good night. Thank you all for coming, and I hope this was helpful. Bye.